Excuse me. Now, the second great way of saving money, and this is something I'm quite passionate about, is moving off research-based measures to what we call operational metrics of performance. A wonderful management consultancy company, and I say they're wonderful because they're a client, called Bain, wrote a book about 20 years ago now, and just got a follow-up book, and they've told pretty much every major service organisation in the world that you actually only need to ask one market research question, and that's the question up there. And if you can ask this question, you can compute something called a net promoter score, where you work out how many people said they'd recommend you, how many people indicate they definitely wouldn't recommend you, and the difference between that is your net promoter score. Now, if you're trying to cut money and you can get everything down to a single question, you're going to say the bomb. The problem is, you do it and someone goes, yeah, we need the rest of South Australia, and that costs you a bit more money. Somebody else tells you, I need a national study. Don't be provincial, I've got to talk to everybody. Somebody else says, yeah, we need to get by product, by brand, and by call centre. Or in the case of Bain, they'll tell you that you need to have 60% of your customers ask this one really important question. And somebody else goes, well, there's no point knowing how everybody was doing on the 27th of August 2009. We need to be tracking it over time. And all of a sudden, our one single question has become a very, very expensive bit of research, particularly because it's actually not such an informative question. And even Bain, after asking this, will go, well, why? Because it turns out that just knowing that somebody says they're likely to recommend you doesn't give you that many ideas. Now, the solution to the problem in this situation, this is I would say, very much a service organisation type solution, is you need to be working out how the market research metrics, be they satisfaction, likelihood of recommendation, perceived value, how they relate to internal metrics. And you do that in a very basic way, which is you get a sample of your customers, you conduct the survey with them, and then you link up the survey results to your internal records. We've taken great care not to violate any privacy issues. And you can do it, although much debate reigns on this issue. Every large service organisation does do it. And then what you do is take the situation where we might be dealing with call centres dealing with particular branches of banks. We can measure, we might want to match up our net promoter score with how many calls customers are making. We might find that amongst customers who don't have to call a call centre about a particular branch, the net promoter score is pretty high, they've got no trouble. People who have to make one call to the branch, to the call centre in a year, they'll have a lower net promoter score. People who've got two, well, things aren't going so well, they'll have a much lower net promoter score. People who've got three or more calls, clearly the problems aren't getting resolved, they'll have a much lower net promoter score. Again, now, that you get a relationship like that's pretty obvious and it's not so insightful, but the key thing about it is, once you have that, you can use it to work out research results, if you like, or your net promoter score for a whole lot of branches and banks and whatever type of things you're measuring you haven't talked to. So looking here, consider we've got two call centres. The first one is in a situation where of the customers who are assigned to that call centre, 90% never call. Well, we know that people who don't have to make the call have got a net promoter score of 30 because we learnt that from the market research, so 90% of 30 is 27. We've got 10% who had to call once. We know they've got the net promoter score of 4, so 10% of 4 is 0.4, and we add them up, we get a net promoter score for the call centre of 27.4. Doing the same maths for call centre 2, we work out that they've got a lot more people making a lot more calls, and we know that translates to a lower net promoter score, which gives us an estimated NPS of 17.9. Now, the key thing about doing a computation like this is the market research gives us the underlying framework, linking how the customer feels and how the customer acts to our internal metrics. But once we've understood that relationship, we can just use the internal metrics to understand how our performance is going over time. And it obviously becomes very easy to do week-by-week estimates of our performance, to do branch-by-branch estimates of our performance without having to do an impossible number of interviews. The same basic idea can be applied to segmentation and pretty much is by all large, no, that's not true actually, increasingly is being applied by most large service organisations and also by some product organisations who are able to buy online data. The idea is that you do your market research in a fairly, you can be doing it in a traditional way or you can do it in a much more modern way to understand what the needs of the market has. But then you map these onto your internal data, which can be customer records, it can be transaction data, it can be usage data. So, for example, if you think of something like a mobile broadband card, or a mobile USB card, which increasingly people are using to connect to the internet, you might do a market research study which tells you there's two core needs being addressed. One is the need to not have to access the internet through a fixed phone line. The other basic need is the need to have wireless or mobility. And you might look at your internal data and work out that younger people tend to be much more likely, when you match the internal data, you might work out that younger people are more likely to be in the situation of not wanting, the segment not having a fixed line. And you could also work out that people who are accessing their internet from lots of different mobile phone towers, because obviously if you've got, when you use a wireless or mobile broadband, you can actually, the phone company can work out which tower people are accessing from, and that gives you a way of identifying the mobility of individual consumers. But the key point is, once you've mapped your internal data onto the customer needs data, you pretty much throw away the needs data. Because if you're able to accurately identify, if you're able to semi-accurately identify different groups of your customers, having used the survey to tell you the way, but then you actually can just use internal data to work out who is who, segmentation becomes a lot more powerful because you're able to 100% accurately allocate people to segments and simply say, we know this customer is in this particular segment and we can get the exact right amount of direct marketing to them or other forms of communications or product offers. Do-it-yourself research. I'm a big fan of do-it-yourself research. I'm not trying to put market researchers out of business here, but if you go back to the big pie chart that I started with, there's a few bits which are quite readily done yourself if you have a constrained budget. At the end of the day, if a market research company's been doing what they've been doing for 50 years, they're going to do it a lot better than you're going to do it if you're doing it yourself more often than not. But if you've got a constrained budget, client management is certainly something you can do yourself, so that's a great way to save money. Research design, I don't want to be rude here, but if you're not a market researcher, you can't do it. It's like advertising. Everybody who's not an advertiser believes they can come up with an ad. Everybody who's not a market researcher thinks they can design good market research. They can't. You really do, if you're going to do your own, need to engage expertise here, because there are lots of mistakes that are obvious to any experienced researcher, but if you're not a researcher, you don't know they're a mistake until the end, and I'll come back to that in a second. Project management, you can do that yourself. Interviewing and fieldwork, increasingly there's a whole lot of tools to help you do that yourself. Data analysis and reporting, same ways. Strategy and insight, not really a DIY opportunity, and this might sound controversial because most marketers seem to believe market researchers are quite bad at providing strategy and insight, and there might be some truth in that, but we're quite good at reading numbers. Most marketers are quite bad at reading numbers, and so the challenge becomes that if you don't engage expertise to interpret your data, there's an extraordinary high chance that you get the completely wrong interpretation, and you might come up with a strategy that was brilliant if your interpretation had been correct. And the obvious example for this is a simple question such as, will you buy this wonderful new product? Every market researcher knows that the answer you get from that is at best indicative, but every client, if left on their own, turns that into a revenue forecast, and that becomes slightly ugly. So, saving money. First thing is to get out of your office, get out of the boardroom. Peter's talked about a whole lot of ways you can do that, and I think they're all wonderful ways. There's more basic ways of literally talking to people. It really comes down to budget. If Peter, and I'm not sure if this is what you're saying, but I kind of heard this, if you're saying that you can, $30,000 project where you touch the customer twice or so, you can touch them 30 times for $30,000. If that's what you're saying, this is the man whose business card you need, because that's a wonderful, wonderful value solution. But if you can't do that, you need to find cheaper ways. And it always shocks me, and this particularly, I have to say, I'm doing a lot of work with Telstra, how things that everybody knew had to be shown in a report. And if you actually talk to your customers, you learn 90% of the really obvious problems with a product. Now, who should do the research? Does anybody recognise this charming man? He is, or was, a quite famous scientist. His name is Richard Dawkins. He came up with a wonderful idea called the selfish gene, which is really a metaphor which says that survival of the fittest takes place at the level of the genes. Each gene kind of fights. I don't quite understand what it means, but I think it's very clever. But he's much more famous for writing this book, and you can't quite read it there, called The God Delusion. This book has outraged and offended people throughout the world. I think he even had a fatwa taken out on him.